Two officers handcuffed a black woman and joked, "She looks dangerous enough." No one watching laughed. No theft, no threat, no violence. Just Naomi Reddick, 42 years old, in a long gray coat, reading quietly in a public park, becoming a threat because she didn't fit the image of belonging. But just weeks later, when her face reappeared behind a federal bench, everything flipped, because the woman they mocked was now Judge Reddick, keynote speaker for the state's Law Enforcement Reform Commission. If you think this was just one bad incident, ask yourself, what if no one had filmed that moment? Don't just shake your head and scroll on. Share this story. Drop a comment. I still believe in justice. And follow Mr. 7 Stories, because every story we tell is one more reason to believe change is possible. Now, join me as we follow the incredible journey of Naomi Reddick, a woman who turned humiliation into a verdict against an entire system. Naomi Reddick sat alone on a wooden bench in Glenfield Park, Wexley Borough, a place that had long been her quiet refuge after grueling days in court. It was a Sunday afternoon. The late autumn sun filtered through the yellowing trees, casting a soft glow on the book she held, The Souls of Black Folk. A gray wool shawl draped gently over her shoulders, her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her face serene in a world that rarely slowed down. No one expected that peace to be broken by the sharp scuff of leather shoes on the brick walkway, followed by the static crackle of a police radio. Two officers closed in from behind, as if approaching an armed suspect. Rhett Maddox, a tall, broad-shouldered white man, stepped forward. His uniform still bore the faint stain of late breakfast coffee. Behind him was Brady Kernell, younger, hesitant but silent. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" Maddox asked, one hand hovering near his holstered weapon in a wordless warning. Naomi looked up, calmly keeping her place in the book. Her voice was steady. "I'm reading. Why do you ask?" "We received a report of someone acting suspiciously in the park. Do you have identification?" That question, so seemingly routine, carried the full weight of a system conditioned to distrust a 38-year-old black woman sitting alone in silence. Naomi opened her bag deliberately and handed over her state ID and Georgia bar license. Maddox glanced at them, squinting slightly, as if struggling to believe that the modestly dressed woman before him held a higher degree than he did. "You're a lawyer?" "Yes, and I believe the right to read in public hasn't yet been revoked." Brady looked at his partner, uneasy, but Maddox had already made up his mind. He gave a curt nod, then signaled, "You'll need to come with us for questioning." "On what grounds?" Naomi's tone stiffened. "We have the right to investigate suspicious behavior," Maddox replied. "No specific reason, no charge, just the hollow gaze of a man empowered, and now misusing that power." Naomi was handcuffed on the very bench where she used to sit with her mother years ago. Around her, people stopped. A young boy paused a soccer game. An elderly man propped up his bicycle, eyes wide. A woman pulled out her phone and started filming. The moment a black woman, offering no resistance, was taken away from a quiet afternoon simply because her presence was deemed unsettling. As Naomi was pushed into the patrol car, she didn't cry, but her hands trembled, not from fear, but from anger, not for herself, but for the system she once believed she could change from within. The police car rolled away, leaving behind a shawl tangled in dry leaves and a fractured trust beneath the autumn sky of Glenfield Park. This story did not begin with a crime. It began with silence, misunderstood. The holding cell door at the Wexley Borough Police Department slammed shut behind Naomi Reddick, echoing with the finality of a sentence rather than an administrative inquiry. The ceiling was low, the fluorescent lights cast a sterile, cold glare, and the overpowering smell of bleach stung the nose, like an attempt to scrub out any trace of humanity. Naomi kept her composure on the outside, but inside, a tide of anger swelled like a storm trapped behind steel ribs. She was ordered to stand before a blank white backdrop, the same one used for mugshots. No one told her what she was being charged with. She asked. No one answered. On her third attempt, a desk officer finally muttered, "Obstructing an officer." Naomi let out a bitter laugh. I was sitting and reading a book. No resistance. No foul language. No movement. Where's the obstruction? The officer shrugged. Not my call. Her arms were stretched out for fingerprinting. A form stamped, Reddick, Naomi. Possible resistance was added to the file. In the same system she had once defended through the rule of law, she was now being dragged through its mechanisms, those she once believed were just. Inside the cell, Naomi sat silently on the cold metal bunk. Across from her, an older white woman lay curled on another bed. She asked softly, "What did they get you for?" Naomi answered, "Reading in a park." The woman let out a dry, tired laugh. "Oh, that one's heavy, if you're one of us." On social media, the video taken by the bystander was going viral. The hashtag reading while black started trending on Twitter. A 57-second clip, showing Naomi calmly responding to officers before being handcuffed, was circulating with the caption, "This is what they call resisting." In just 6 hours, the video racked up over 2 million views. Comments poured in. A lawyer gets arrested for sitting still. This is America, 2025. Would this have happened if she were white? Not because she did something wrong, but because they couldn't handle her silence. While Naomi huddled under a thin blanket, outside those concrete walls, hundreds of thousands of people were learning her name. Not from Courtroom win, but from a moment of injustice exposed beneath the glare of sunlight and smartphone cameras. No one called to inform her. No lawyer was offered. No apology was made. But Naomi knew she was no longer invisible. She couldn't have known that from this cold cell, a tremor was starting to ripple. Not because she screamed, but because the world had heard her silence and couldn't stay silent anymore. Naomi Reddick walked out of the Wexley Borough Police Department the next morning after more than 17 hours of baseless detention. Her eyes were shadowed from sleeplessness, her shirt wrinkled, her wrists still swollen with the marks of tight handcuffs. Her release didn't come from decency. It came from public pressure and the timely arrival of a formidable name, Desiree Holloway, an old friend and a prominent civil rights attorney, who showed up with a full copy of the Civilian Protection Act and a very clear threat to file a formal grievance with the Georgia Attorney General's office. At first, the officers hesitated. The desk sergeant, a white man in his 50s, glanced at Naomi's file, then looked at her as if she were a burden to be discarded. No one apologized. No one explained. They simply unlocked the cuffs, handed back her phone and wallet, and turned away in silence. Naomi stepped outside, wearing the same wrinkled shirt, her wrists swollen from the tight restraints. Her eyes were ringed with fatigue from a sleepless night, but her gaze was steady, like stone. Desiree said nothing. She just opened her arms and embraced her friend beneath the pale morning sun. "You okay?" Desiree asked softly, the pain in her voice unmistakable. Naomi answered quietly, her voice firm as steel. "No, but they won't forget me." That evening, Naomi sat down in her small third-floor apartment on Pinewood Street, opened her laptop, and placed a steaming mug of coffee beside it. She created a new folder on her desktop titled, Reddick versus Wexley Borough Police Department. She began at the beginning, watching every second of the footage that captured her arrest, logging every unlawful action. No warning, no reading of Miranda rights, no lawful cause for detainment. Then came the footage of her being brought to the station, photographed, fingerprinted, without a single official charge documented. Naomi knew this wasn't just personal. It was a test of the entire system. Desiree brought her a list of civil rights attorneys who had won state-level lawsuits. They held an online meeting at 10 p.m. On screen, 3 middle-aged men and a silver-haired woman listened closely as Naomi recounted her story. One of them, attorney Reed Mallory, who had successfully prosecuted a police brutality case in Chicago, nodded solemnly. "If what you're saying checks out, this isn't just wrongful arrest. This is contempt for justice in broad daylight." Naomi responded without blinking. "And I want to make it precedent. Not for compensation, but to make sure no one ever thinks they can humiliate a person of color and just walk away again." In the days that followed, Naomi reemerged, not as a victim, but as a fighter. She held a small press briefing outside Glenfield Park, the very place where she was arrested. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her clothing simple, but her eyes no longer carried the weight of humiliation. They held the fire of someone reclaiming justice. "Some have asked why I won't forgive," she said into the microphone. "My answer is this. Forgiveness is personal, but justice is public. And I don't live to be easy to forgive. I live to defend the right not to be degraded." The crowd clapped. An elderly man in a veteran's cap nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. A day later, Naomi officially filed suit. Naomi Reddick versus Wexley Borough Police Department, Rhett Maddox, and Brady Kernell. She didn't hire a spokesperson. She didn't seek media spin. She was just a lawyer, carrying a case file, walking into court, placing her faith in the truth. At Glenfield Park, someone had quietly planted a small sign in the grass. Justice doesn't have to shout. It just has to stand. Naomi never sought attention. She didn't expect her incident to reach beyond a few lines in the local news. But on Monday morning, as she walked into the small coffee shop on the corner of Lancaster Street, the entire cafe stood and applauded. A young barista, wearing a deep brown apron, handed her an espresso with a handwritten card that read, "Because you stood up, we can't sit still anymore." Online, the hashtag #StandWithNaomi was spreading fast. But what moved Naomi the most wasn't the shares or the trending topics. It was the messages she received. A single mother from North Glenfield who said the police once detained her son for 6 hours for looking suspicious. An elderly man who had been pulled over 3 times simply for driving an old Cadillac. A Latino college student who said the video of Naomi being handcuffed made him start to believe he wasn't the only one being followed in grocery stores. Then came a letter, no return address, tucked in her mailbox. The paper was yellowed, the black ink tilted like it had been written by an elderly hand. In 1961, I was kicked off a bus for not giving up my seat. I hung my head, thinking I didn't deserve to fight back. Thank you for standing up. For those of us who were taught to bow our heads. RWH. Naomi clutched the letter and sat by the window in silence for 30 minutes. On Saturday night, a small gathering was held at Glenfield Park. There were no microphones, no stage, just a group of people forming a circle around Naomi. They brought flashlights, walking canes, homemade cookies, and something even more precious, stories they'd never spoken out loud before. A middle-aged, white woman spoke up. "I'm the wife of a police officer. I used to hear my husband call people like you educated troublemakers. But now I know you're not the trouble. You're the warning the system refuses to hear." Applause rippled through the night air. Naomi felt a chill down her spine, not from fear, but from the deep certainty that something was finally beginning to change. As conversations unfolded, a boy around 13 quietly stepped forward. He shyly pressed a crumpled drawing into Naomi's hand. It showed her standing tall, hair flowing, holding a law book. Behind her were 2 officers, heads bowed. In the corner, written in shaky pencil, "I want to grow up to be like you." Naomi broke down in tears, not because of fame or support, but because she realized the silence of someone once humiliated, if held with courage, could become the voice of a new generation. And in a distant corner of the park, hidden beneath the shadow of an old oak, a dark SUV sat quietly. From inside, a pair of seasoned eyes watched, not taking notes, not intervening, just observing. On the dashboard rested a field credential from the FIU, the Federal Integrity Unit, with a raised silver seal. Public trust is earned. Naomi had no idea she was being watched, but someone from a higher level had begun tracking every step she took. Following the press conference at Glenfield Park, the lawsuit Naomi Reddick versus Wexley Borough Police Department, Rhett Maddox, and Brady Kernell quickly drew public attention. The complaint was formally filed on Tuesday at the Wexley Federal Court, accompanied by the full video documenting the unlawful arrest. Civil rights organizations swiftly stepped in, and local media launched dedicated coverage of the case. But what surprised everyone most wasn't just Naomi's determination. It was the groundswell of support rising from the community itself. At Glenfield Library, where Naomi had once volunteered to teach free legal classes to students, A small sign was taped to the community board. If you've ever been treated unfairly by the police, tell us your story. Within 3 days, over 20 accounts were collected, ranging from a black mail carrier being randomly searched to a single mother being ordered not to film as her son was forcibly restrained. These stories gave Naomi strength and slowly turned her into an unlikely symbol of justice. She didn't chase the spotlight. She turned down interviews from national networks. But in Wexley Borough, the image of Naomi Reddick, with her neatly tied curly hair, walking out of the courthouse clutching a stack of legal files, became a living question that haunted the community. How much injustice are we still willing to tolerate before we act? A month later, Attorney Reed Mallory informed her that the police department had requested a settlement negotiation, but Naomi declined. She said it plainly during a meeting with the legal team. If all I wanted was an apology check, I could have taken it the day I was released. But I need this system to witness its own consequences, and that needs to be recorded publicly in a verdict. No one expected that her case would become the catalyst for something even bigger. On a fog-heavy Monday morning in Wexley Borough, a courthouse Crown Victoria rolled down Main Street, veering into the private rear entrance of the Glenfield Federal Courthouse. Inside the vehicle, Naomi Reddick sat silently, a neatly folded black judicial robe resting on her lap. Her eyes stared out the window, through the misted glass, toward the park where, just months before, she'd been handcuffed in broad daylight. Life's irony is strange. That day, Naomi didn't arrive as a victim or a trial lawyer. That day, she arrived as Federal Judge Reddick, recently confirmed through a quiet but weighty appointment process led by the Southern Civil Rights Judicial Council. The first case assigned to her, an internal disciplinary hearing with criminal implications, filed by the Wexley Police Department. A straightforward matter on paper. 2 officers accused of falsifying records and conducting an off-grid interrogation of a teenage boy of Asian descent without a guardian present. Naomi had reviewed the initial file the night before, annotating it carefully. But it wasn't until the morning of the hearing, when her clerk handed her the full case folder, that she froze at the sight of the names listed at the top of the report. Officers Rhett Maddox and Brady Cornell. 2 names she would never forget. They were now under investigation for another wrongful arrest, this time exposed in the ripple effect of Naomi's original lawsuit. The department's internal ethics board had recommended prosecution. And so, in a strange twist of justice, the case had found its way to the Wexley Federal Courthouse, where Naomi now presided as a federal judge. Courtroom 2, 3rd floor. The clock read 9:13 a.m. The 2 officers were escorted to the witness bench, their posture a mix of discomfort and reluctant humility. They clutched legal documents, unaware of who would preside over the hearing, since judge rotations were determined by a randomized federal algorithm for case security. The courtroom clerk struck the gavel. A court officer stood formally and announced, "All rise for the Honorable Federal Judge Naomi Reddick." The doors behind the bench opened. Naomi stepped in. Her black judicial robe swept down to her ankles, her shoulders squared, her steps measured and deliberate. When her eyes met those of Maddox and Brady, both men froze. Maddox blinked 3 times, as if unsure of what he was seeing. Brady tilted his head slightly, lips pressed into a thin line. Neither of them spoke, and there was nothing left to say. Naomi nodded to the defense attorney, then looked toward the defendant's table. "Before we begin, I want to make something clear. Today's proceedings have no bearing on any prior personal history between myself and the defendants. I will preside strictly according to the law and the evidence presented." Maddox swallowed hard. Brady's face flushed red. The courtroom wasn't large, but that day it was packed. Among those present were the parents of the Asian-American boy who'd been unlawfully detained, a group of law students observing the process, and seated quietly in the back row, Tobias Reed, the former state Supreme Court justice, now an honorary member of the FIU. At one point, Tobias leaned over and whispered to his companion, "This is the moment the system stands trial, without anyone needing to shout. She just has to stand where she is." The hearing lasted 2.5 hours. Naomi's voice never wavered. Video evidence, time-stamped footage, and testimony from a local convenience store clerk were presented in sequence. Maddox attempted to justify ambiguity at the scene. Brady avoided Naomi's gaze the entire session. At the end, Naomi didn't rush to a verdict. She spoke clearly. This court will deliberate within 48 hours. Justice doesn't come from urgency, it comes from precision. As Naomi rose, the warm ceiling lights cast a golden hue over her robe like armor forged from truth. And with every step she took away from the bench, a new generation was learning. Some answers don't need to be shouted. They just need the right person in the right place. The next morning, 9:05 a.m., Courtroom 2 once again held a silence tight as a drawn wire. On the bench, Naomi Reddick sat poised, hands interlaced before her chest, her gaze sweeping calmly across the room. Under the soft yellow glow of the oak-paneled dome, her composure became a barrier between the tension below and the clarity of the law above. At the defense table, Rhett Maddox leaned toward Brady Kernell to whisper something, but neither dared look up toward the bench. Not after yesterday. Maddox, the same man who once stormed up to Naomi on a park bench, face inches from hers, snapping on cuffs like he was claiming a prize. Brady, the one who sneered, "She doesn't belong in public spaces." Now, both sat shrunken, their old police uniforms replaced by dull suits, like schoolboys summoned to the front of the class by the very teacher who once saw them cheat. Only now, the teacher held the power to rewrite their future. Naomi gave a subtle nod. The court resumes proceedings on case number 22, B475. Defendants, Officer Rhett Maddox and Officer Brady Kernell. She paused, locking eyes with them for the first time that morning. And let me repeat, my personal experience is not a factor in today's legal decision. If either of you hope for bias or revenge, I regret to inform you, you'll be disappointed. The room was silent. Only the soft hum of the air vent and the faint scratch of a reporter's pen in the back row broke the stillness. During the defense attorney's presentation, Maddox struggled to keep his voice steady, though sweat glistened at both his temples. At one point, he accidentally dropped a folder of documents, sending photocopies fluttering across the floor under the defense table. As he stooped to retrieve them, Brady clumsily bent down at the same time, and the two nearly bumped heads, an awkward moment that drew quiet chuckles from several observers in the courtroom. Naomi didn't smile, but she wasn't cold either. Her face was like a mirror, reflecting their expressions back at them without revealing a single trace of her own emotions. When it came time for questioning, Naomi flipped through a case file and read aloud in a steady voice. Officer Maddox, in your report dated March 15th, you wrote that the suspect appeared suspicious, avoided eye contact, and behaved uncooperatively. Could you clarify what you meant by uncooperative behavior? Maddox pressed his lips together. He couldn't very well say. She was reading a book. I was operating on instinct, Your Honor. Naomi gave a small nod without comment. She turned to Brady. And you, Officer Brady, did you amend the detainment record sometime after 6:17 p.m. that day? Brady froze. There was no room left to dodge. I only corrected a typo. Corrected or deleted? Naomi asked, her voice not raised, but sharper than a judge's gavel. Brady dropped his head. During the recess, Naomi stepped into the judge's chambers. She unfastened the top of her robe and let out a slow breath. Her eyes landed on the small mirror hanging above the credenza, focusing on the faint scar on her left wrist, a scar left by cold handcuffs on that long-ago afternoon. But this time, she wasn't the victim. She was the one shaping justice. Outside the courtroom, Maddox stood in the hallway, nervously calling his wife, his voice trembling. Brady leaned against the wall, trying to hide his shaken expression behind a pair of sunglasses. Not because of the light, but because of shame. In a corner of the room, Tobias Reed, retired judge, smiled faintly to himself. Told you before, he murmured. Justice may arrive late, but it always finds its way home. At 9:58 a.m., the gavel struck once more as Judge Naomi Reddick returned to the bench. Sunlight filtered in from the high rear window, casting a soft glow along the edges of her black robe, like the room itself was holding its breath before justice spoke. The court calls witness Zaire Coleman, announced prosecutor Mira Thatch. From a gallery, a young black man stepped forward. He wore a plain white shirt, a light bandage still wrapped around his left hand. His eyes were steady, but carried the weight of something deeply hurt. He gave Naomi a respectful nod, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Naomi gave a subtle nod in return. Please tell the court what happened on March 15th at the intersection near Westridge Deli, Mira asked gently. Zaire drew in a long breath. I was just standing there, waiting for the light to change. I had my headphones in. Then the patrol car pulled up. 2 officers, Maddox and Brady, stepped out. They asked if I had a gun. I said no. I even raised both hands. But they still shoved me down. My knee hit the curb hard. And I still remember. One of them said, "That's enough reason." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Naomi tilted her head slightly and jotted a few notes in her pad. No one noticed her hand tighten briefly around the pen. Did you resist in any way? Mira asked softly. No, I didn't dare. I just said, I didn't do anything. And then they cuffed me. Zaire paused. His eyes began to blur with tears. The air in the courtroom thickened, heavy with something unspoken. Suddenly, a soft rustle broke the silence. From the back row, an older woman, mid-60s, stood abruptly, tears streaming down her cheeks. That's my son, she cried out. Zaire is my baby. He's never had a single ticket, never raised his voice to anyone. And they treated him like an animal. Naomi gave a small nod to the court officer, who approached gently to calm the woman, without removing her. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a courtroom. It became a mirror, reflecting the trembling conscience of a community. After a brief silence, Mira proceeded. Your Honor, the prosecution submits dashboard footage recorded automatically from the patrol vehicle. Naomi gave a signal to the clerk. The screen to her left flickered to life. All eyes turned. The video was clear. Zaire stood alone on the sidewalk, calm and motionless. The patrol car rolled up slowly. One officer exited, hand already resting near his holster. The other opened the rear door, as if preemptively preparing for an arrest. There was no aggression from Zaire. No movement, no threat, just a forceful shove and the unmistakable sound of flesh hitting concrete. Brady Kernell leaned forward toward the screen, his face ghostly pale. Rhett Maddox exhaled sharply and slumped back in his chair, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Naomi said nothing, but her expression changed. No longer the composed neutrality of a detached judge, but a glint cold and precise, of truth breaking through the veil. She looked at Maddox, then at Brady, not with hatred, not even anger, but with the clarity of something deeper, justice waking up. She closed her notebook and turned to Mira. The court acknowledges the testimony and accompanying evidence. We will reconvene this afternoon for the defense's presentation. The gavel struck once more. Yet no one rushed to leave. The people, elders, teenagers, community organizers, remained seated as if they hadn't witnessed just a trial, but the turning of a page in their city's story. Zaire stepped down from the witness stand, his shoulders trembling, but his eyes no longer downcast. Naomi watched him walk away, then murmured, only to herself, just above a whisper. This is only the beginning. That afternoon, sunlight pierced through the tall windows of Wexley Courtroom, sharper and more direct than in the morning. The proceedings resumed with the sworn statements of the defendants, Rhett Maddox and Brady Kernell. Judge Naomi Reddick sat tall behind the bench, tapping her pen slowly against the file in front of her, no longer observing quietly, but with intent, watching every flicker of the eye, every tremor in their speech. Not to find fault, no, justice had already done that, but to see whether either man had the courage to look back at the line they'd crossed, or if they would try to walk it again. Brady Kernell was called first. He stepped forward, visibly tense, hands clenched tightly behind his back. His pale face twitched slightly as he passed the gallery, rows still packed with townspeople, elders, college students, and a group of high schoolers furiously scribbling notes beside their civics teacher. Officer Brady, the defense attorney began. Can you walk us through the events of March 15th? Brady swallowed hard, his eyes darting across the room. We received a call about a suspicious individual near the intersection, he began stiffly. When we arrived, the person was standing alone, not doing much, but not doing anything, the attorney prompted, keeping his tone steady. Then what prompted you to push him to the ground and handcuff him? Brady faltered. Zaire didn't comply when we told him to step away from the area. We felt the situation could escalate. Did you issue a clear order for him to move? I think so. Maybe my tone wasn't clear. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Naomi raised a hand gently to signal for quiet, then tilted her head and pinned a brief note into her legal pad. Next was Rhett Maddox. Unlike Brady, Maddox appeared more composed, but his eyes never once met Naomi's. He spoke through tightened jaw muscles, leaning heavily on his lawyer's phrasing, trying to frame his actions as tactical discretion. We are trained to respond quickly in ambiguous situations, Maddox said. And when a subject fails to cooperate, we have to make judgment calls. Naomi looked up, not with heat, not with disdain, just a calm question that cut sharper than any accusation. Do you believe on that day you took every step as a responsible officer should? Maddox froze. The room held its breath. 1 second. 2. 3. I think I could have handled it differently, he finally admitted, voice lower now. I could have called for backup. I could have tried talking first. Naomi's pen stopped midline. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was earned. Not because his answer was explosive, but because it was human. No excuses. No layered defense. Just a shard of honesty. But even a shard of truth can crack a wall of silence. The prosecutor glanced at Naomi, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. No further questions, Your Honor. Naomi closed her notebook. Her eyes drifted toward the courtroom's high window, where sunset streaked across the sky in deep, molten gold. Not the color of an ending, but of something beginning. A prelude, a shift, a quiet promise that the next page might be written not in rage, but in clarity. Court will recess until tomorrow morning, when sentencing will be delivered. The gavel fell. Firm, clean. No one said a word, but everyone felt it. Maddox's own testimony had already become the most damning sentence of all, one that required no ruling. The next morning, Wexley Borough Courtroom was packed once again. But this time, there were no whispers, no skeptical glances, only silence, heavy, unmoving, like the weight of judgment itself. Naomi entered in her black, judicial robe, face calm and composed. Below, Rhett Maddox and Brady Kernell sat upright, their confidence gone. Both sides had already delivered closing arguments the day before. Now, all that remained was the verdict from the woman they once threw into a cell like a nameless detainee. Naomi opened the file in front of her. Her eyes didn't waver from the decision she had written the night before. Her voice rang out, low, steady, not cold but resolute. After reviewing all testimony, evidence, and conduct related to the incident involving Mr. Zaire Coleman, this court finds that the actions of both defendants reflect a clear abuse of authority, a failure in situational judgment, and a violation of the ethical standards expected of sworn officers in the state of Georgia. She paused briefly, then raised her eyes. The court orders suspension from duty for 12 months without pay, mandatory participation in an 8-month ethical reformation program at the Clearwood Institute of Legal Reform, and permanent disciplinary record notation. No applause, no sighs of relief, and yet the room seemed lighter, as if a long-standing moral debt had finally been paid. Naomi gave a soft strike of the gavel. This hearing is adjourned. Rhett Maddox stood up, moving slowly toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, he stopped, then turned. His face tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to remorse. A second passed. Then he spoke, quiet but clear. I'm sorry. Naomi didn't respond right away. She looked at him, not warmly, not coldly. And finally, she gave a single nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that at the very least, he had taken one small step toward the truth. Brady Kernell said nothing. He lowered his head and followed. Outside the courthouse, gentle sunlight stretched across the gray stone steps. A group of law students from Wexley College approached Naomi, asking if she would take a photo with them. She smiled softly, but declined. Today isn't about me. Today is about doing what must be done, even when no one thinks we should. One young student quietly asked, "Do you ever get tired, Judge?" Naomi smiled, this time more visibly. Tired, but not enough to stop. She turned away, and the hem of her black robe fluttered in the soft April breeze. And somewhere in the air over Wexley Borough, between the sound of slow footsteps and the wind rustling through the trees in the park, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just beginning again where it all went wrong. 2 months after the trial of Maddox and Brady, a new headline appeared on the announcement board in front of Wexley Borough City Hall. Judge Naomi Reddick to speak at statewide law enforcement reform conference, Atlanta, Georgia. No one called her the Glenfield Park victim anymore. Now, she was a voice people listened to, not because she won, but because she refused to break. Naomi didn't leave the courtroom, but she didn't confine herself to it either. She attended community meetings in small towns like Fairfield Hollow, Ashgate, and Old Rosebend, places where state officials were rarely invited. She listened to every story. A mother pulled over and searched while driving her child to school. A retired soldier handcuffed for crossing a crosswalk too slowly. Naomi didn't lecture. She sat, took notes, nodded, and then, when she rose to speak, her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "I can't change the past, but I can help make sure it doesn't happen again." In Atlanta, she worked with the Georgia State Legislative Reform Council. Her name was added to an advisory panel on nonviolent intervention procedures. Thanks to Naomi's proposals, police departments were now required to retrain officers on distinguishing suspicious behavior from implicit bias and to reaffirm basic civil rights, long neglected in many rural counties. One Saturday morning at the Glenfield Community Hall, Naomi joined a small student forum. An 11th grade boy raised his hand and asked, "Judge Reddick, how did you not get angry when they treated you that way?" Naomi looked at him for a long moment before replying. "There were times I was very angry. But if I let that anger control me, I wouldn't be much different from them. Justice doesn't need yelling. It needs people willing to stand still and not back down." The room fell silent. The boy nodded, and Naomi knew a quiet revolution had just happened. On her desk at the courthouse, she kept a framed photo. A worn stone bench beneath an old oak tree in Glenfield Park, where it all began. Nothing special. Just a faded bench under a canopy of leaves. But to Naomi, it was a daily reminder. Change doesn't start on big stages or with grand speeches. It begins the moment an ordinary person chooses not to look away from injustice. And across the state of Georgia, from Wexley to the remotest counties, people no longer refer to Naomi Reddick by title. They spoke her name with reverence. No statues, no medals. But in hundreds of conversations in schools, hospitals, gas stations, that name rang out like a truth. Justice is real when we refuse to let it die. Naomi Reddick's story isn't just a verdict of justice. It's a reminder for all of us. Silence isn't surrender. It's strength when paired with integrity. Naomi didn't need to shout to be heard. She only needed to stand tall and let the truth speak for itself. In a country where too many are pushed aside for how they look or where they stand, Naomi reminded us that justice isn't a privilege, it's a right. She didn't wait for someone else to speak for her. And in doing so, she paved a path for thousands more to rise, without fear of being dismissed. If you've ever felt small in the face of injustice, remember Naomi. If you've ever witnessed unfairness and didn't know what to do, remember. One action, one word, one act of empathy can be the spark that ignites a greater change. What do you think of this story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed injustice? How did you respond? And if you believe this story deserves to be heard, don't hesitate to like, share with someone close to you, and subscribe so we can keep telling true stories that touch hearts and shake the system. Because sometimes it's the most ordinary people, like you, like me, who create the most extraordinary turning points.